Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on this topic of zootography, a topic that is very near and dear to me. My name is Ashley, and I will be your instructor for today. A little bit about what we're going to cover. The class topics today will be lens selection, so choosing the right lens to take with you to the zoo, some camera settings, recommended custom buttons and menus. We'll go over a little bit of composition and then some tips and tricks for getting better images while you're at the zoo. So starting right off with lens choices for zootography. The first lenses that I'd like to talk about are actually going to be wide angle lenses. So wide angle lenses are going to be anything that really falls in between that like 12 millimeter to about 35 millimeter. Uh, I always make sure that I have a wide angle lens with me, and this is the perfect lens to have if we're going to photograph anything with an aquarium. So a lot of zoos have aquariums, and then there's also dedicated aquariums that a lot of people go to. Having that wide angle lens helps you to capture stuff like this. And the way I go about using that wide angle lens is I actually put the lens right up on the glass, and then I will have the zoom or the lens zoomed to the widest point so I can take in as much in front of that camera as possible. And then I can actually watch the animals, and I'll use the back screen on the camera instead of the viewfinder. And then this way I can watch as the animals are swimming into the frame and get ready, and I can shoot as they enter the frame and as they move throughout the frame. When we talk about wide angle lenses, like I said, we're talking really anything about 12 millimeter to 35 millimeter. If you have an APS-C sensor camera, this would be like an A6000 series camera, then we could also look at the 10 to 18 millimeter. Again, this gives you an extremely wide field of view. In full frame, we're going to be looking at the 12 to 24 millimeter, and that's available in both an f4 or a 2.8 version, or the 16 to 35 millimeter, again available in a f4 or a 2.8 version as well. The next set of lenses that I like to make sure I have with me will be a macro lens, or at least a close focus lens. And this comes in super handy, especially if your zoo has a butterfly garden or a botanical garden connected to it, anything like that. And it just helps you get these nice kind of extreme close-ups of bugs, flowers, things of that nature. If we have an APS-C camera, we're going to be looking at the 30 millimeter macro, the 50 or the 90. With full frame, we'd be looking at the 50 millimeter or the 90 millimeter macro. If we are buying a macro lens specifically to photograph critters, if you will, so this might be frogs or lizards, this might be butterflies, things of that nature, I would actually look more towards the 90 millimeter macro. And that's because it's going to give you more working distance. So I can be a little further away, but get that same up close focus. And that way the animal is less likely to run. Our next set of lenses will be telephoto lenses. So these are going to be bigger zoom lenses, really anything that's going to cover outwards of a 300, 400, all the way out to 600 millimeter. And we use these to get those in tight shots, so kind of those extreme close-up shots that we want. But also there's some exhibits where the animals are just really far away, and the only way to get there is with that bigger lens. So a bunch of different options for you within the Sony system. You have a couple different 70 to 300 options. You have the 70 to 300 millimeter G series lens that will work on full frame. There's also a 70 to 350 millimeter lens that will work on APS-C. And then you also have a couple different 70 to 200 millimeter lenses. So in both a 2.8 or an f4 version. There's a 100 to 400 millimeter lens and also a 200 to 600 millimeter lens. All of these will get the job done. The reality, I would say most zoos, 300 millimeters is probably enough reach to get even to some of the far back parts of exhibits and get the whole animal in the frame. If you want to start getting more really tight close-up shots like we saw with the flamingo, then we're going to probably be looking at something that goes out to 400 or 600 millimeter. All right, so let's talk camera settings. So the first thing that I always advise people, especially if it's a new camera to you, is to make sure that you actually have your eyepiece adjusted properly for your eye. There's a lot of times where I get questions on why the camera seems to be focusing, but everything looks soft. And it's just that that little diopter switch got bumped in the camera bag. So make sure that that's dialed in for you. If you've never used the camera before, if it's fresh out of the box, the easiest way to kind of set it up is going to be going into the scene modes and setting the sports and action mode. This does a few things for you. It's going to give you the fastest shutter speed possible, so it's easier to freeze action. We're also going to put the camera into a continuous burst mode. So as you're holding down the shutter button, it's going to keep taking photos. And then the autofocus system will be set up to continuous, so that as the subject is moving near or far, the camera will readjust focus for you. If you're a little bit more familiar, a little bit more confident with the camera, then we can start looking at some of the semi-automatic modes. So we have shutter speed priority, and this is going to work in the sense that you're going to select a shutter speed that works for you. This might be a fast shutter speed to freeze action or a slow shutter speed to show movement. The camera will match an aperture value to it to balance that exposure out. From here, you can also make adjustments to the burst mode. So you can put it in continuous burst. You can put it in continuous autofocus as well. I should touch on this. The other option for you there is the A, or aperture priority. With aperture priority, it's just the opposite. You're going to pick an aperture value to control your depth of field. The camera is going to assign a shutter speed for it. And then same thing, you control your drive and you control the autofocus type as well. So continuous autofocus and then continuous burst is also controlled by you. The way I tend to shoot the camera is I actually go into manual exposure. And now in manual exposure, I'm setting everything. I'm setting my shutter speed, my aperture, my ISO. I'm turning on the burst mode. I'm turning on the autofocus mode and the autofocus area. So this seems a little daunting to people typically, in that they get kind of worried that they have to kind of micromanage all of these things at once. And it's much simpler than that, really. So the way I tend to go about this is I will set, again, manual exposure, but I'm going to set my aperture based on the depth of field I want. So this might be anywhere from a 2.8 to an f8. That's a big range, I understand. The only times I really go into a 2.8 aperture are if I'm in a lower light area of the zoo and I need the light. Otherwise, a lot of times these animals have a lot of depth to their face. And if I'm at a 2.8, I might have a nose that's sharp and in focus and their eyes are soft, or their eyes are sharp, but their nose and their ears are soft. So a lot of times I'm going to venture to shooting at like a 5.6 aperture or even an f8 aperture if I'm trying to get the whole animal in focus. Now I set my shutter speed. And again, this is going to vary based on the animal. Some animals are more active than others. And then also what kind of mood I'm trying to show as well. Am I trying to freeze the animal in place, or am I trying to show movement as they're walking or running through the exhibit? So this will vary, again, based on light, based on what I'm trying to show, but typically anywhere between a 250th of a second to a 1,000th of a second, depending on the animal. And if I'm trying to pan with them and show movement, I may even go slower than this, all the way down to maybe a 10th of a second or a 20th of a second. This is what makes it simple though. So I'm actually going to set my ISO to auto, and then I'm going to control the limit that that ISO functions in. So the levels are going to run from 100 at base, and choose this on your own camera as your preferences are going to be a little different than mine. But a lot of times I let the camera run from 100 ISO to 10,000 ISO, and the ISO will just fluctuate as it needs to balance out that aperture and shutter speed that I've previously selected. And then typically I'm using a lens that's going to reach out to 200 to 600 millimeter. When I go to the zoo, a lot of times I'm taking that 100 to 400 with me. It's a nice size and it has a good amount of range to cover the things I'm trying to photograph. Usually the argument comes up of, well, I've been told I need to keep my ISO as low as possible. And while that may be true, as we're trying to keep the image as clean as possible, less graininess, less noise, I would much rather have a slightly noisier image that is in focus as opposed to something that's cleaner but blurry. So these two side-by-side examples really only work for a teaching example. If it were me coming back from the trip, the one on the left would just get deleted. So this is where pushing that ISO limit is going to be beneficial for you. Also keep in mind the newer cameras are significantly better at high ISO. And if you're shooting JPEG, the camera's actually doing noise reduction on that file as well. So you might be surprised at how good the camera can perform all the way up to 10,000 or 12,000 ISO. So our drive mode, while we're at the zoo, we're gonna wanna stay in continuous burst. And the reason for this is that it gives me the most amount of options during the shoot. And the biggest thing that I can point out is to overshoot the subject. So as my subject started, I'm just holding down the shutter button. And as he moves, you can see I'm catching frame by frame by frame. And normally I'd probably stop here thinking, oh, that's the shot. But instead I held on, and actually some of these worked out quite a bit better. So I would advise holding down the shutter button longer than you really think you need to, because there's a lot of times where we assume we got it and we let off the shutter button and there's no time to recover and get the shot afterwards. So overshoot the situation. You can always delete the one or two extra shots that you have that you didn't need. All right, so let's talk about how to set our autofocus for the camera. So first up, focus mode. And you're gonna have a bunch of options on your camera. At the zoo, these are kind of the three that I tend to use. AFS, not often, really only if the animal is laying or sleeping, something like that, where they're really not moving, then I can get away using AFS. But if there's movement, the problem being because we're in that burst mode, if they're running, maybe that first shot is going to be sharp and in focus, but as they've moved closer or further away, they're going to fall out of focus. So that's why a lot of times I keep the camera on AFC, so continuous autofocus, and that way as they move through the frame, the camera will continue to focus with them. Every now and then I find myself using manual focus, and this might be in situations where maybe I have like a bird in a tree and the camera wants to continuously focus on the leaves right in front of the bird. I can quickly switch into manual focus and just manually focus past those leaves and then keep shooting. As far as focus area goes, again, you have a lot of options presented to you. The camera by default is going to start out in wide, where it's looking at all of the focus points available. The only downside of this is that it has to follow some rules. And one of those rules is whatever's closest to the camera is going to be priority, unless we have something like face detection or something like that enabled. So I like to limit where the camera is looking to focus, and I will actually go to a flexible spot where it's one single focus point that I can move, but I will use it in the lock-on or tracking autofocus area. So if you have your camera in front of you right now and you go into your autofocus area, which can either be accessed through the function menu or in the actual full camera menu, you'll notice at the very bottom of the list you have an option called either lock-on or tracking AF. And you'll notice there's two arrows left and right on this. If you toggle those, you can actually switch between any of the other focus areas, but it will do the tracking capability with it. Meaning once it's locked onto my subject and I'm holding halfway down on the shutter button, that focus point will now follow my subject throughout the frame. Another option that you have is animal eye autofocus. This works predominantly with more pet-based animals, so dogs and cats it works really well with. things that look like dogs and cats, so like lions and things of that nature, it also works really well with. Uh, the database for animals is significantly large, and the problem being some of the coloration and spotting on some of the animals will confuse the AI. So for many cases, I don't use it unless it's something like a lion or a fox or something that's a pretty solid color base. All right, moving into customizing your camera. So we'll talk about setting some custom buttons. The buttons that you can customize on the camera are pretty vast, and really almost all of the buttons on the camera are customizable. These are the feature that I really save for buttons that I need, or rather features that I need quick access to. So I want to press one button, be right into that feature. I don't want to pull the camera away from my face to finick through a menu and try and find something. Instead, it can just be one button press and I'm there. So the way we get to that is if we go into the second camera tab on your camera, and it's usually like the second to last page in that second tab. And you'll have an option that says custom key or custom key settings. Within there, depending on your model of camera, you'll either have two lists, one that's on the left and right. One on the left will tell you what button we're looking at or talking about, and the option on the right will tell you what's currently set for that button. A lot of the newer generation of cameras actually have it set up like what you're seeing now, where it will show me the button we're talking about and what's currently set for it. But I can click into any of these and I'll have a whole list of options that I can set to that button. Some of my favorite things to set for custom buttons, if I'm using an A7 series camera or an A9 series camera, I like to have the focus mode, focus area set for C1, C2. On an A9, you can't do that because it's actually on a dial, but on the A7 series, I can set the focus mode on there. And then this just allows me to still keep the camera on my eye, but as I press C1, I can toggle between AFS, AFC. I can also quickly toggle between different focus areas as I need to as well. C3 on the A7s is kind of out of the way. It's on the top left side of the camera. And because of that, a lot of times I actually just set this to be in-camera guide. On the newer generation of cameras like the A7R4 and so forth, this feature is actually just built into the camera now, so I don't actually have to have a custom button set for it anymore. But what it allows you to do is, as I'm in the menu, I can press that button. It'll give me more information on any menu item. So kind of nice if I'm trying to figure out what I'm looking at or things like that. It's super helpful if you're new to the system as well. For the custom for button, I like to toggle the touch functionality. That way I can just quickly turn that on or off as I need it. I leave the thumb pad left and right, which are already preset to be drive mode and ISO. And it's really just because I've been using them that way forever, so it's easier just to leave them that way and keep going. Thumb pad down, I like to switch to be white balance. So then I can just quickly press down and adjust my white balance as needed as well. The center button, and this is more for using with the macro setup, but I like to have that set for focus magnifier, and then I can manually magnify what I'm looking at as I'm manually focusing. So I can really just fine tune focus. And then the focus hold button that's on the lens, I actually switch this to autofocus manual focus toggle. And the reason to do that is, again, I have the camera up to my eye, I'm shooting. I don't want to have to pull the camera away from my face to find the switch on the lens and hit it. That button's just instinctively right where my thumb rests anyway. So I can just press that button and away I go. Kind of your next level of customization is actually the function menu. So on the back of your camera, there's a button that says FN. If I press that, it pops up this function menu. By default, this is going to have a lot of the preset modes that people most commonly use. A lot of those I've already set as a custom button. So I can actually go ahead and reset them as something else. To go ahead and customize this, you're going to go to the same spot we were at for the custom button settings. But now you'll go down to the option called Function Menu Settings. Some of the items that I put on here, and again, these are just ones that I use. You may have something that works better for you. By all means, use that. But some of the pieces that I like to add to this will be subject detection. This is if I'm using something like an A7 III or more current that has animal eye autofocus on it, then I can quickly swap between human and animal eye autofocus without having to go into the menu to switch it. I also like to have the steady shot settings on here as well. If I'm shooting on a tripod, shooting long exposures, it's really nice just to be able to toggle that on and off. Picture effects, just to give more of a creative look. Do note that the picture effects only work if you're shooting JPEG mode though. And then there's an option for DRO or auto HDR. I like to have that on the back as well. Just again, quick access to it if I want it. The final level of customization comes in the way of My Menu. My Menu is a really nice piece. This really allows you to create your own menu bank at the very end of the menu tabs. I put things like formatting my memory card and stuff like that, but you can actually build multiple pages and customize it for like a page of just the video settings you're constantly using, or a page of just the camera controls you're always using, things like that. But these are pieces that I will save here that I use frequently enough that I don't want to have to go in through the menu into each individual tab and page to find these pieces. I can just put them all in one location. All right, so we'll talk on composition here as well. The first thing that we really need to harp on for composition is borders and backgrounds. And just like everyone else, I have a big problem where I get hyper focused on the subject and I start ignoring what's going on behind the subject, what's going on to the sides of my frame as well. And so we just have to be diligent about that. Probably the most common thing I run into and that I see with others' photos as well is something like this, where I get, again, focused on that subject and I ignore the fact that there's a big bright line running right through the head of my subject, which is a big distraction for the viewer looking at it. This can all be fixed simply by changing my perspective. So by me just kneeling down a little bit and shooting the same photo, I now drop that branch up over the subject. And so now it's a lot easier to capture them without that big bright line running through their head. Some of these pieces also show up where I'm photographing my subject and I have random branches or things like that hanging into the side of the frame. Yes, I could probably go into Photoshop and correct it later, but sometimes it's actually easier for me just to change that perspective again. On this one, if I had just shifted to the left, maybe 10 feet, that branch wouldn't even be in there and I could be photographing away. Again, I got hyper focused on the cuteness here. And so I ended up clipping his ear in the branch. On this one, there's not a whole lot I really could do. I was already tucked down pretty low. So there's not a lot I could do. So this is one that I would probably say I just have to go in and Photoshop and fix it. More commonly, we run into a lot of stuff like this, where it's things in the foreground that actually get so defocused we don't really see them as we're shooting. And it's not until we get up onto a monitor and now we notice, uh-oh, I've got a whole bunch of shrubbery or debris or what have you right in front of the subject, and it's kind of a distraction. So on this one, I would actually probably, as I got home and I already have the image already shot, there's not really any adjustment I can do, I might even just look at this and go, I'll just crop the photo like so. And that will be my image. And the main reason for this is over here, all I'm seeing is red panda butt. So it's not really anything amazing that the image is going to lose not having there. And I'm getting rid of that distraction by doing that crop. So for me, that's probably more where I would go. Sometimes it's much easier just to fill the frame with that subject. So in this image, there's nothing wrong with my borders or my backgrounds. And actually my background is the subject, not really the peacock that all of those nice plumage is connected to. Kind of another example of giving a nice clean background. I've managed to stack my subject on more of the brighter side of it. And a lot of what I shoot is, and you'll see this coming up too, is more rule of thirds based. And the reason for that is I have shot a lot of stuff for zoos, and it's nice to give them something like this where now they can drop an advertisement in the image. So they might actually look at this and go, okay, great, we can put our ad right here on my image, or whatever promotion they're trying to run. So it's kind of a nice piece to give them that blank slate to work with. The other thing to remember is that there's definitely an orientation that these animals have. So some of them, it might be like this, where it's horizontal. If I tried to shoot this vertical, I'm just adding a bunch of exhibit to the photo, which doesn't help anything. And really our goal as a zoo photographer should be to make this look as much in the wild as possible. Granted, that's going to have varying difficulty based on whatever zoo we're at. So these guys, definitely more of a vertical feel to them. Again, if I shot horizontal, I'm just adding a bunch of extra exhibit to the image. Another piece I always kind of harp on is leaving room to breathe in the photo, or giving the animal room to walk into the photo. So I don't want to shoot too tight on the subject. So something like this is a typical frame I may shoot, where it's wider than I really need it to be. But when I get home and I'm starting to put this together, or maybe the local zoo asks for an image that they can use, they have options here. So not only can they run it this way, but they might be able to do it this way if they're doing maybe a newsletter, or if they're doing a membership sticker or something like that. They can do more of a vertical crop. If it's a social media post, they could do an easy square crop. If they're going to put it on Facebook, they could do a nice horizontal crop. And you'll notice they still have a bunch of flat space to drop marketing materials into if they need it. So leave yourself with some options. Same concept. I could have gotten a little closer. I could have framed it a little different. But the nice thing here is that it leaves me room. If I want to crop it in tight, I can do a vertical crop, or I can leave it as it is too. Symmetry is another great thing. It's hard to capture this because the animals obviously don't cooperate super well, but when you can capture it, it's a fantastic use. Something like this where I can get in nice and tight, and really the two sides mirror each other very well. Water works great for this too, giving you a nice reflection. Again, another reflection shot. And this is a shot from way, way back when I first started photographing at zoos. If I had to reshoot this now, again, as we've talked about, I would have shot this wider so that I could get more of that reflection into the image. Sometimes the exhibit is not going to be very attractive. And the way to work around this is to fill the frame, or get as much of the animal in the frame as possible. So getting in as tight and close as we can. So again, filling that frame. The other way to use the exhibit to your advantage is to use it to frame the subject. So this way we kind of lock the viewer's eye in on the subject. So with my leopard here, you can see I'm using that tree as kind of my frame in the image. And this doesn't always have to be a solid line like what you're seeing right now. Sometimes we can actually use multiple elements in the frame. So this rock here, maybe this other log up here. And what we can do is actually create kind of a border around my subject with those different elements. Kind of another example here. rhinoceros hornbills. Unfortunately, they're up in a tree, and as I shoot up, there's no way to hide the fact that we're in an aviary. But some of the composition that we can use in there is, again, using some of those elements in the frame to help frame your eye on the subject. As I talked about, rule of thirds is probably the one that I use the most. So what we want to do is try and put our subject on one of those lines that run through one of the thirds. And ideally, if I can put a main part of appeal, if you will, on one of the intersecting portions of those thirds, that's where the viewer's eye is going to be drawn to. So something like this, where we have two subjects and we can stack them close to those two thirds. The viewer's eye does more of like a ping pong effect, moving from one to the other and back. So it really kind of keeps them engaged and locked on that image. And as I was talking about, we also want to have the subjects facing into the frame. We don't want them to be facing out of the frame. So I want them to be looking into space in the frame, not looking right at the edge. So something like this. Had I cropped this image or shot this image where my subject, you know, the frame cuts off right here with my subject, it's now something where the viewer looks at it and instantly is kind of disengaged from it because they're now looking at it and going, okay, well, what is the animal looking at? So this way, it kind of keeps more movement in the frame for the viewer. All right, so some tips and tricks for you to get better images while you're at the zoo. The first big thing I can talk to you about is going to be timing. So when do you go to the zoo? The ideal times to go and photograph at the zoo are right when they open, because the animals are just going out for the morning. A lot of them are going out onto exhibits that they haven't been on overnight. And so there's going to be all different critters that went out there, you know, mice and bunnies and things like that. So there's all kinds of different scents and odors for them to go sniff and remark. So they're going to be very active in the morning as they go re-explore their habitat. The other time would be usually a couple hours before the zoo is going to close. And this is because now the animals are active again as they're getting ready to go in and have dinner. So those are the two times where you're going to have the most activity from the animals. Timing wise, though, also what time of the year you go to the zoo. So I live in Minnesota. In the winter, I actually really like going to the zoo and photographing outside because there's not a whole lot of people there, but also the animals are more active as it's colder and they're moving around. In the summertime, as it gets a lot hotter, the animals are going to go find shade and they're going to lay down to try and stay cool. So fall, winter, even that early spring are all great times to go to the zoo. The other piece I can point out is to dress the part. So take note of what the zookeepers at your local zoo wear and try to mimic that as much as you can. So at the Minnesota Zoo, they wear a kind of a Kelly green shirt or sweatshirt. And the nice thing is if I wear that same color and I go into the exhibit to go photograph, a lot of times you will get the attention of the animals because they think you're a zookeeper. Keep in mind that that animal interacts with that zookeeper every single day, all year, for many, many years. That zookeeper is the person that gives them attention, gives them food, gives them enrichment. They have a very strong bond with them. So seeing those colors or that pattern brings that back and they think, oh, what are you doing here? So you will pique some interest from them. This might just be a moment. So if they're laying, sleeping, it might just be raising a head and looking to confirm who you are or who you are not. But that is always enough time for you to get a quick shot. Whereas if they're just laying in the shade ignoring you, there's not a whole lot to work with there. Unfortunately, some zoos have a very unattractive look where it might be solid khaki and you have to work with what you got. I'm sorry. All right, probably the number one culprit for zoo photography is barriers, fencing and glass. So overcoming fencing is usually the hardest part for a lot of people. There's two things that we can do. As we're photographing through the fencing, we want to get as close to the fencing as we can. And ideally, if we can aim the center of our lens through an opening in the fencing, it will greatly reduce how much of that fence kind of crisscross look we get in the image. We can also set a smaller aperture number, so like an f2.8, and that's going to diffuse my foreground and my background more significantly, and that will actually hide that fence more for you as well. The other big culprit that people have with shooting through fences is that they're choosing the wrong part of the fence to photograph through. So as we look at this image, if I photograph through the top part of this fence, this is the image I'm going to get, which is typically just going to get deleted. It's not even going to make it into a presentation unless you're an instructor. Now, if I choose to shoot through the bottom part of this fence that's in the shade, that's what I'm going to get. So a much more usable image. Again, it's a animal sleeping on exhibit, so it's not super exciting, but it illustrates the point of which part of the fence to shoot through. And as you can see, I was able to get up close to that fence, and you really don't see it at all in the image. Glass is a whole nother nightmare to work with, unfortunately. And the main problem that we have here is that the glass we get is typically this. So there's smudges and smears and who knows what on that glass. So ignore the animals in this image. We're just going to focus on the window for my explanation here. So a couple key things I would point out. One, bring a rag with you and have a rag in your camera bag. That way you can usually take that and wipe off a small space to shoot through. Don't put Windex or anything on it, just a rag as it is will work. But a lot of times you can clean off a spot to shoot through on the glass. With that said, as we approach an exhibit like this where they have kind of these big walls of windows, typically this is off just because it's covered in smudges, it's covered in fingerprints and nose prints and who knows what. So basically think of every child between the ages of 2 and 12 has pretty much covered most of that. Everything way up high is just out of reach. So a lot of times, unless I'm holding my camera way up over my head and using the back screen, a lot of times it's just too high up there. Otherwise, it would be a great piece of glass to shoot through. The one thing people usually overlook is that where these seams are, I usually have maybe 3 to 4 inches on each side of it, where it's pretty clean and I can actually shoot through it no problem. I guess people don't like to stand there and look through the seam part of the glass, but that's usually a pretty clear spot on the glass to shoot through. Sometimes the culprit for bad glass is on the other side, and there's just nothing you can do about it. Glass presents an extra challenge in the sense that it throws off our color balance in the camera as well. So that big old thick piece of glass usually puts a big blue cast or a green cast in the image, and it's really going to throw the image off. On your camera, if we go into the white balance options, you'll notice there's an arrow that points to the right. If you press that, it brings up this color adjustment grid. Within here, you can actually adjust that color balance, even in auto white balance. So it's the ability to take an image that looks like this, where it's kind of got that greenish hue to it, or tint to it, and actually adjust it to something like this, just by readjusting that white balance. So it makes a world of difference. Reflections are kind of another nightmare on the glass. And then also how you choose to shoot through the glass. So this gentleman is trying to use a polarizer and standing away from the glass to shoot. I have had varied success with the polarizers, and a lot of times it ends up slowing my shutter speed down enough that it's just not that helpful for me. So what I actually recommend is getting up close to the glass. But when we do get up close to the glass, we have to pay attention to how we're shooting through the glass. So we need to be shooting straight through the glass once we go up next to the glass. So if you put your lens hood on your lens and then put that lens hood right on the glass and then shoot straight through it. If I go off to an angle like I did on this one, it's just not very sharp. And you can see when we kind of magnify it, how that sharpness gets thrown off. And really that's because that glass is 1 to 2 inches thick. So it's very, very thick stuff. And if I go at an angle, it's going to really warp the image for me. Something like this, I actually shot straight through the glass and it's quite a bit sharper. This will also help get rid of reflections a lot better. So again, taking my lens hood, putting it on the lens, putting my lens right up on the glass. And then as I shoot, without doing that, I have all these reflections. When I put my lens up on the glass with the lens hood, I cut out all those reflections. The last bit of advice I can give you is to be patient. Ideally, if you have a membership for your local zoo, go often and really pick a couple different animals that you're going to photograph that day. Hang around the exhibit, wait for them to do something. Again, if you go in the middle of the afternoon, they're probably going to be sleeping. But if I go early in the morning, I can get some activity out of one of them. I can go walk the zoo and enjoy a bit of it for a couple hours. And then once I get a little later in the afternoon and they're getting ready to go back in, then I can actually get some more activity from another animal. So if you have a membership, take advantage. Sit with your favorite couple animals throughout the day and photograph them. There's been a number of times where I've walked up to an exhibit, I looked at it quick and said, nah, I don't think anything's happening here. I start walking away, and then all you hear is the ooh, ah from the crowd around it. And by the time you get back to see what the excitement is and the animals are actually doing something really cool, there's a huge mob of people blocking the entire front of the exhibit, and you really can't get a good photo. So be patient. Again, pick your favorite animals, hang out there, get some photos. To kind of recap, so choose the exposure mode that's going to work for you. If you're new to the camera, choose the sports mode in the scene modes. If you're somewhat comfortable with the camera, aperture and shutter priority work well. I would advise going full manual and setting it up like we talked about in the beginning. We want to make sure that our drive mode is set to continuous burst and that our focus mode is set to continuous autofocus, or AFC. Practice your composition. Rule of thirds is an easy one to practice at every exhibit. Filling the frame if you don't have a very attractive exhibit to work with. And then if you have elements in the frame that work for framing, play around and try it out as well. If we have barriers, glass or fencing, get close to it. It's going to help hide it. Either find a clean spot to shoot through on the glass or make one yourself. As we get close to that glass, make sure you use your lens hood. It'll help cut out a lot of that glare on the glass, and it makes it so I don't damage my lens if I end up smacking it into the glass as well. And then be patient. Take your time while you're there. You're there to enjoy it. Again, get a membership, go often, hang out at the exhibit, and really patron your favorite animals is the way I look at it. So for me, a lot of times this might be things like a lot of the carnivores, so bears and tigers and leopards. I love photographing those guys, but everyone's got their favorite animal. I really also like going into the aquarium areas and shooting, especially jellyfish. Love shooting jellyfish. And then as you saw, the otters as well. I love watching them swim around and in the play in the water as well. So there's more than enough stuff to shoot. So memberships make it super worthwhile for a photographer. Hope you enjoyed the class. Thanks for tuning in.